We started growing cover crops in the mid-90s after wheat, and we actually started interseeding red clover, frost seeding red clover in the spring into a stand of wheat. We would always harvest them, mechanically harvest them. We did not graze them back then. In 2005, we started putting our dairy heifers out on our cornfields. And since then, we've just progressed with that. The cover crops after the wheat is just a great fit because it's almost a no-brainer. Otherwise, your field will be weeds if you just don't plant anything. And so you no-till in that crop, you don't disturb the soil. The crop grows, you put the cattle out there, they put all their waste back out in the field. It's perfect. When we started no-tilling, this is way back in 1991, one of the first things you notice is how many more earthworms are in your fields. When you go back to check the depth of the seed, you take your knife and you start digging and where are all these worms? Because that was never before. When you were working the soil, you don't see that many worms. So that was the start of that soil health thing. 2009, we got our first yield monitor in our combine. This field behind us, we had cattle about halfway across this field. This is a half-mile long field. When we were going across this field with the yield monitor, where the cattle were, the yield was much higher than where the cattle had not been. That was the first aha moment about having animals on your row crop fields. Because it's very hard to tell that in a pasture because you don't have a yield monitor as you're going. Yes, you can go with a stick and everything, but that yield monitor, boom, right now you knew. I've said before, there's something, biological activity from the cattle depositing their urine and their manure right on the land, and our yields have been much better because of it. As long as you protect your land, that meaning if it's wet, don't have your cattle out there. We built the heavy use area with NRCS cost sharing funds to have a place for those cattle when they shouldn't be out on the land. And my philosophy is if your tractor shouldn't be on the land, your cattle shouldn't be on the land. And so by having that heavy use area, and it's got a vegetative treatment area that catches all the dirty water coming off and just works out very well together because of the closeness to Lake Wisconsin. So the demonstration area was a 3-year project, and year 1 it was soybeans. After wheat, we planted the peas and oats in a multi-species cover crop. There was about 30 different species in there actually. And then we grazed that off in the fall of 2021. In the spring of 2022, we planted corn into that field, no-tilled it of course. And we had some volunteer buckwheat come back from our multi-species mix. We were hoping to graze these corn stalks last fall after we got done combining them, harvesting the corn. But it was so wet that we just didn't get that done. So they're out here now this spring, grazing what's left of the corn stalks, spreading their manure out a little bit. And in less than a month here, we will no-till soybeans into those corn stubble. And then this fall, we will no-till wheat into this field after the soybeans are combined off. And so that's the 3-year rotation, corn, soybeans, wheat, cover crops after the wheat. The goal is always to have a crop interseeded into the corn so that in the fall you'd have some green stuff growing with the corn stalks for the cows to eat.
I started with cover crops back in 2011 was my first experience with them. Rotational grazing for me started in 2021 when I purchased some land and converted 30 acres of it over to rotational grazing because I wanted to increase my cattle production, and I figured that was the only way I could do it rather than try to with concrete and buildings. So I've only had a few years experience. It hasn't always been sunshine and rainbows, but I deal with it, and I kind of have a unique system, I think, as far as I started out with winter bale grazing before I started rotational grazing, so I kind of maybe did it backwards, but it works for me, so I kind of got the best of both systems now. I seeded it down the year before, and then I had them come in and put the fence in and everything, and it's high tensile fencing, 4 strands with a single strand in between the egg lanes, and then divide it with poly wire. I'm enjoying it so much that next year I'm converting another 28 acres over to a rotational grazing. Biggest benefit I'm seeing is that the fact that it's easier for me to feed my cattle. I go out there and I move them. It takes me 10-15 minutes or whatever, and I can feed 30 cattle, move them just that quick, and I I don't have to have the bedding, I don't have the manure to haul and stuff like that. So I think it's a win-win situation. I'm moving them every day, and so each parcel is probably about an acre. And then once I get through that, my rotational grazing part, I have a permanent pasture with some woods and stuff, so then I can take them off my rotational grazing land and put them on there for a few weeks so I can give the rotational grazing land a little bit longer rest. This year with the drought and everything, I haven't had them out on my rotational grazing land as much as I've wanted to, just because I didn't have the growth and stuff. And so it was, do I sacrifice my rotational grazing land or do I sacrifice my permanent pasture? And so they've been on permanent pasture most of the summer since the middle of August, and I've been having to feed them and stuff. I've been doing cover crops since 2011, and for me, my idea is to extend my grazing season. If I can keep them out on the ground or out on the land, then rather have them in on the concrete. Like I said, I don't have the bedding and I don't have the haul manure and stuff. So if I can extend my grazing season, that's what I'm trying to do. My cover crops follow my winter wheat, and then my corn follows that. So I'm actually trying to graze the cover crop, but yet get the benefit from the cover crop for my corn for next year. For me, the grazing has to be close by. For my fence setup for my cover crops and everything, I designed my own permanent posts. They're portable though. I used an 1,800 pound cement block, and I bolted a 8-inch post to it. So now I can put them in my corners, and so I can stretch wire on them. I can set the post and stretch wire right away, rather than digging a hole, having to fill it in, and then when you pull wire like that, you pull your posts over and stuff like that. So the biggest things that I've seen since using cover crops would be my earthworm population has really increased, and the soil tilth, I get better water infiltration and stuff like that. Since the project started and everything, we really didn't know what to expect, and I was just getting into rotational grazing and into grazing cover crops and everything, so this is all kind of new, but so far it's been a good thing for me. Well, I'm definitely going to keep the grazing covers.
We have about 300 head of cattle that we're rotationally grazing currently, and we have about 350 acres of perennial pasture that we're grazing these cattle on. We're moving the cattle on a daily basis, and we have 25,000 feet of water line ran around the farm to water the cattle out in the paddocks. So we have a lot going on in our pasture system and accomplishing our goals by having a lot of water lines so we can move the cattle on a daily basis. We have a lot of permanent fencing on our farm, but our paddock divisions are all ran with temporary fencing. We're rotating between our permanent pasture fields and cover crop fields that we've been grazing. So that's part of what we've been doing with the Sand County Foundation, is grazing these cover crops off. And that's working out real well for us. And we're keeping our principles going of moving the cattle on a daily basis, even if we are on a field that is a row crop field, even though it ain't perennial pasture. We're still moving the cattle very often. So now we're in fall of the year normally, and we're heading towards going into winter feed. So that kind of alleviates some winter feed by feeding hay. We can turn them out on these cover crops. So we're saving money by turning the cattle out in these fields and actually making them forage for their own food again. And we have better health with the cattle out there grazing than you would in a confined yard. And you ain't hauling manure and things like that. So no bedding, no manure. And we are extending our grazing season into December instead of, beginning of November. So at least a month we're extending it by grazing these cover crops. We have about 350 acres of perennial pastures, but with them row crops that we're grazing at least 100 acres of row crops every year. Ideally is our goal. So we can really help extend our grazing by throwing in them extra 100 acres of row crops with cover crops on them. Corn, soybeans, and winter wheat. And our cover crops that we like to graze are planted after the winter wheat, or small grain. When we're rotationally grazing, our pastures are having up to 120 days of rest before we're grazing them again. So they're adequate recovered, and we're getting a lot more growth off our pastures. If we were continuously grazing them all the time, had a set stocking rate, our pastures wouldn't flourish because they'd have it ate down short all the time. We started using cover crops back in 2003, so we're well into 20 years of using cover crops in our farm. And the main reason we started using cover crops is for weed suppression after a winter wheat, is our biggest thing we started with. So the whole project with the San County Foundation, we worked on interseeding one year and interseeding cover crops in the corn. And now we've done that in the past. And one thing that we learned from this project is that, that year it failed when we did it with the project. And we've done it in the past successfully. We don't do that every year, so that's not a practice we really are great at, knowledgeable in. But we do have failures, and we didn't say we threw it under the rug and threw it away, but we do it again in the future, But just things like that we learn from with the whole project, so worked out great. SWIG is our Sauk Soil and Water Improvement Group. It's a local watershed group, and there's a handful of us farmers that are really involved in the group, and we're trying to spread conservation across parts of Sauk County and implementing cover crops, rotational grazing, and just getting the word out that us farmers out in the country are trying to do our part in saving our soils and just helping the environment in general.
So farmers growing crops that don't have any livestock should search someone out who would put livestock on their land for that biological activity. You get the cows depositing their waste right out in the field, turns into better yields, works out better for everyone. And I'm a grazer. So in 2006, we converted about 50 acres at the home farm here of row crop land into rotational grazing land. That's a tough sell for someone. Putting some animals on a field like is behind me here is not as tough a sell, because you don't have to commit years and years and years. All you have to do is put up a fence, and it can be a temporary fence, around your field and put some cattle out there. And when they see the yield bump in their monitor when they're combining their crops in the future years, they will say, hey, there must be something to this. And you may get them to go more to a grazing, rotational grazing in the summer, and putting your animals on your row crop fields in the other times of the year. But that's the catch, is you don't have to convince everyone to go to grass right away. Baby steps.
Well, the best advice I can give is to go and look at what other farmers are doing and see if that system would work for you, or how you want to change it or something a little bit. Because not every situation is going to work for each farmer. For cover cropping, I would say try it on just a small acreage. And within 5 years, you will see a difference.
When you're starting with cover crops, you want to take it slow. Try a little acre of your farm or 10 acres of it and kind of work into it, see what fits your system. Because you don't want to go and say, well, so-and-so is doing that and that works for them, but will that work in your system? Your management style, your farm, your operation is totally different than the neighbor down the road. So take it slow, but definitely give it a try. I think cover crops are one of them things that, you try a few times and see what fits your operation, because one thing might not work this year, but the weather is a big factor, and it might work great next year. So I'd say you gotta give it a few year trial basis before you really know if it works in your operation. I'd think if you're going to look at grazing cover crops and you have an opportunity with a nice piece of cover crop out there, go ahead and graze it, even if you're new to the whole process and you want to get out there and try it.